what is it that you're doing when you decide to change? Well, the answer is you're building an altar towards the heavens because you've decided that your current pattern of action is ungodly. Now, what are you willing to sacrifice? I'll sacrifice everything about me that's not worthy.
Meaning and true freedom comes from accepting the constraints that the world places upon us.
Sexual freedom. There's nothing about that isn't golden calf worship.
Right,
it's preposterous. So they're all lost. Well, we can do whatever we want. It's like, no, you are now the slave to the worst of your whims. And there's nothing that makes people more miserable than that. Well, and you also see a revival of religious belief, particularly in attendance.
So what's taking you so long? Today I'm joined by an author, a psychologist, and an old friend, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. We're going to be talking about story, sacrifice, the Bible, political philosophy, and the renewal of Christianity in the West, and Jordan's own role in catalyzing that phenomenon. Welcome to First Light. Jordan Peterson, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We've been talking for many years about so many different topics, politics and culture. But I think our first conversations were about really religion, metaphysics, psychoanalysis. So I thought we would start there. You've just come up with this wonderful book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. And I see in that book traces of conversations we've had, lectures you've given here in Cambridge, the impact of those wonderful discussions we had at the Daily Wire on Exodus and the Gospels. Why don't we start there? I mean, why is it that you keep coming back to the Bible for archetypes, for suggestions of how we might improve our lives? It could be, you might have picked Homer, you might have picked the Greek tragedians, you might have picked Dante or Tolstoy or some of the great modern novelists, but it's the Bible you keep returning to. Why is that?
Well, I think the first answer to that question, there's an answer to a slightly different question that has to be addressed before that question. The first question would be, why bother with literature or stories at all? Now, this is a conundrum, let's say, for the scientifically minded, because whatever literature is, it's not science. And you can denigrate it as entertainment, although that begs the question. And the question would be, well, why is it entertaining? And that's actually a scientific question and a biological question. So I started parsing that problem apart when I wrote Maps of Meaning. I started that in 1985 and worked on that till 1999. And I started to understand that the narrative way of looking at the world and the scientific way of looking at the world weren't the same, and that the scientific way of looking at the world is actually nested inside a narrative structure. But I've got better at explaining what a narrative is.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to prioritize your perceptions. And you do that by assigning different values to different phenomena. And a description of the value structure that a given person inhabits is a story. And the reason that stories entrance us is because there isn't anything more important for us to know than how to prioritize our attention. It's a finite resource, it's a costly resource, and there's an infinite landscape of potential perceptions. Mm-hmm. So determining how to organize and prioritize your attention is a very difficult task. And if you're very good at something, and I watch you, one of the things I'm attempting to infer is how are you prioritizing your perceptions, your actions as well, but perception is also an active process rather than a passive process. And so the story's the thing. And the reason the story's the thing is because we have to prioritize our perceptions. Otherwise, we're lost in a morass of facts. Now, the skeptic, the atheistic, materialist, reductionist skeptic might say, well, all facts have equivalent value, but that's a weighting system too. It's a stupid weighting system. All you're doing when you make that claim is presuming that the weight that you assign to all phenomena is one.
Sure.
It's equal. And that's insane. It's not possible.
I mean, just want to press you a little bit on this. I mean, yes, we are at least biological beings, but we're more than that, aren't we? And when it comes to stories and narratives, are you giving enough room to the fact that we are also subjective centers of consciousness, of subjectivity, that there's more to us than merely the biological and the biophysical?
Well,
you could imagine, for example...
There's more to us than a reductionist account of the biological might have. But, I mean, what will happen as we become more sophisticated is our concept of what constitutes the biological will expand, just like our concept of what's material is expanded with the quantum
would you say
theories.
Would you say that consciousness, in the sense that I am an I and not just an it or a biological organism, would you say that itself is conscious? Do you think consciousness will eventually be understood in biological terms as somebody like
not without
John
a
Searle?
Radical rethinking of what constitutes the biological?
But wouldn't that expansion of the biological move into something that is more than merely biological, move into the metaphysical and effectively the immaterial? Isn't the self
that's what's
ultimately
happening.
immaterial, would you say? I mean, isn't the I's view on the world could never be reduced to, your Jordan Peterson's view on the world is something that is private, privileged, only you have access to it. The omniscient neuroscientist who could give me a complete printout of everything that's going on in your brain as you're thinking that thought is not going to be able to give me the printout and help me understand what it's like to be you.
I don't think that we can account for... I've never seen any biological accounts of consciousness that are the least bit convincing.
No, right.
So consciousness is an insoluble mystery at the moment.
Right, and at the moment, so do you think it's a limit on biology? I mean, you've got some people like John Searle, for example, at Berkeley in the early 80s said that, well, what consciousness is you shouldn't understand it in reductively physicalistic terms, but you can understand it in biological terms. So he thinks that consciousness is something like digestion or sweating, but it's a property of a macro system. So we can't understand consciousness when we're looking at the microphysical, but you can understand it as a property of a big system.
Maybe.
When you reach a certain level of complexity.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not that convinced.
I don't think so, because there's lots of... that may be true in the most general possible sense, which would be, well, if you organize a neurological system in a certain way, it becomes conscious. But that's not, there's no content in that theory. It's just an observation.
So even though I think what you were saying earlier must be at least partly right, namely that we have to organize the world as we see it, just in strict evolutionary biological terms, we've got to learn to navigate it. And yes, much of the explanation for that, how we navigate it, how we perceive it, will no doubt have some kind of evolutionary explanation in terms of seeking adaptive value, seeking to maximize survival fitness. But don't you think we've moved beyond that? We've shifted above a certain qualitative threshold there, where those evolutionary just so stories are going to just be explanatorily inadequate. We're going to be
they're already they're already inadequate.
So what I want to know from you is where are we? In what domain of inquiry? Because it seems like we have actually moved beyond the scientific there. We've moved into something else, something that isn't just a question of, biology can't yet explain, but will never in principle be able to explain. We're talking about a different kind of thing when we're talking about consciousness and subjectivity. And with that, the storytelling instinct, the organizing instinct that invests our existence with meaning, that is ultimately irreducible to scientific explanation, scientific accounts. And I wonder, I think
Well, consciousness hasn't proved to be very reducible. So that's been a big problem.
Right. It's always It's
a precondition for experience, and that's a problem.
Right. Yes, it's always buried its undertakers. It's always, it's always buried those who try to explain it away. I mean, there was Dan Dennett's book 20 years ago, Consciousness Explained, which most people joked should have been called Consciousness Explained Away. And it's a big problem. Certainly,
Well,
I know
the biblical account of consciousness in Genesis is very sophisticated, I would say, because so God makes explicit. So God is conceptualized in the opening section of Genesis as the spirit of sacrifice that moves on the primordial waters of potential and chaos. It's something like that. So reality is construed as a dialectic between a field of possibility, that would be the primordial waters, and this spirit of God that is aiming at producing the order that is good or very good. And that's affiliated in Christian thinking with the word. And there's a very particular reason for that. But that consciousness, you might say, that creative spirit,
the ruach,
the breath, that's instilled into Adam, let's say, and into Eve. And then they have their respective roles as embodiments of the same spirit. And Adam's role is very specifically defined. So Adam is to name and subdue, and that is a valuing function. So to name is to segregate out against a background, and to subdue is to hierarchically arrange.
Right.
That is the function of consciousness.
Yes, and that is part of, let's say, what it is for Adam to bear the image of God.
Yes.
And so the account of human origins, Adam meaning man, human, the account of human origins is quite self-consciously in Genesis not a merely material process, as it were. You've got Adam that comes made from the dust, but then there's a transcendent moment of contact from the divine, an immaterial moment, as it were, of a sort of catalyzing of human beings.
Yeah, well, it's a union of spirit and matter.
Right. So ultimately, so taking the Bible at face value, then, a merely materialistic account of the origins of human beings, if we understand it that way, is always going to be inadequate. Would that be fair?
It's been inadequate so far.
Right.
We don't know how our conception of material might transform. Right. That's the only limitation on that. I mean, the way we've understood material. See, the reductionist enterprise is a strange enterprise in some ways, because if you're a reductionist, you reduce something complex to something simple that you think you understand and that is simple. And so atoms as dust might be a good example of that. If the metaphor of atom is dust, right? It's atoms are material objects that have the same qualitative reality as the objects that we encounter in our day-to-day life. Yeah, well, the problem with that isn't what atoms are like, right, or it's certainly not what subatomic particles are like. So as you reduce, the reduction becomes counterproductive in some ways if the thing you're reducing the complexity to escapes from its box. And that's,
if you accept that, you yourself accept that, I accept it, do you share with me the view, for example, that biological death is not death? For human beings.
That's not something that's particularly attracted my attention.
But doesn't it follow? I'm just raising it because we haven't talked about it before.
Yeah.
But it just come to my mind. I mean, if there is an immaterial principle, an immaterial ground of what it is to be you, to be a self that is not biological, then that's not going to be affected by biological death. We persist beyond biological death. I mean, that's not a religious observation. That's just, it seems to me, a philosophical consequence of the view that the Bible is correct in seeing the human self as being an embodied being, but one that is animated by a non-material, non-biological principle or centre of subjectivity that couldn't be affected by biological process precisely because it's not biological.
Yeah, well, to understand that, we'd have to understand the relationship between time and consciousness and individuality and eternity. And those questions are they're utterly beyond, well, they're certainly utterly beyond my comprehension. I don't know how to finally.
Well, we could just be agnostic about that. We could be agnostic about what the self encounters or experiences absent a biological anchoring, but still say it doesn't make sense to say that the immaterial self is annihilated, a non-biological self is annihilated by a biological process.
Like I said, I've occupied myself more with the mysteries that are at hand, let's say. I think my experience in taking apart biblical stories, and this goes to the first question you asked, why did I concentrate on the biblical stories?
Because they're all, look at ancient Near Eastern literature, you've got all sorts of different accounts of human origins that are just as interesting and absorbing and engaging.
Well, and they run in parallel in many ways as well. There are themes that don't reoccur.
Sure.
Well, I have in my writings taken apart many stories that weren't biblical. I spent a fair bit of time in Maps of Meaning talking about the Tao
But you
Te
tend to
Ching.
gravitate to Genesis and it's to Exodus and it's
it's clear that the Bible is the foundation of Western civilization, and for whatever reason, or it's the foundation of biblical civilization, which is what we call the West. It's not exactly obvious that the Bible is a Western text.
Yeah. But that's not only the reason. I think you in our conversations, particularly in those Exodus seminars, I think what we discovered in those seminars, that this text, isn't just important because, it happened to be the foundation, the cornerstone of so much of Western civilization. I think over those many hours we spent exploring the text from all sorts of different perspectives, confessional and non-confessional, is that we came to understand why it was so foundational for Western. It's
not an accident. So that's exactly right.
I don't think it's fair of you to say, oh, well, I'm just looking at this because, as if I'm paying my dues to this.
No, it's not an accident.
We discovered something in it that has a kind of an explosive power, a shaping energy.
Definitely.
That even Homer doesn't, that even Shakespeare doesn't. And so, and what is that? It's not just that these are interesting archetypes. It's not just that these stories have a particularly mesmerizing effect on us. There's something more.
Well, the Jews were a brilliant and literate people, and had selected themselves for that particular ability. And their ancient stories have a stunning depth, and a depth that's been elaborated upon for millennia. And so if you took a sampling of ancient stories and you rank ordered them in terms of depth and quality, you'd be hard pressed to find anything that matches for depth, say, the story of Exodus, which is infinitely deep, as we discovered. But I think there's something that's more important that maybe is unique, at least in terms of the details of its explication, to the biblical text, and that's the twin hypotheses. I guess the first would be that there's a central uniting spirit that animates being and becoming. It's one thing. So that's the monotheistic hypothesis, which is stressed.
And it's not just that's the story that it's telling, but the story that it is telling, it claims to be disclosive of what reality actually is.
And this unitary reality. And then that unitary reality is associated with voluntary sacrifice. And that's key to understanding the biblical text. It's actually key to understanding the nature of civilization itself, because civilization is by definition a sacrificial process.
Sure. Think of the founding of Rome, or you think of that extraordinary scene when Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter to get the fair winds for Troy. Sacrifice is everywhere, but why sacrifice? What is it about sacrifice in the Bible in particular that you think is different or truer?
I think the depth of analysis of sacrifice is unsurpassed. So the entire biblical text, Old and New Testament, is an elaboration of forms of upward striving sacrifice. And the way that the key principles of sacrifice are elucidated is by juxtaposition of a variety of different sacrificial narratives. And you might say, well, why are you obsessed with the idea of sacrifice? And the reason for that is that society itself there's a limited number of principles upon which society might be predicated. You could imagine that you could take a Freudian view, let's say, and that you could make the case that we're basically biological machines driven by the vagaries of our ids, right? And so we're a collection of primordial, evolutionarily determined drives, or you could even think about them as personalities, which is more sophisticated. So for Freud, for example, the dominant uniting force was sex, and even society itself was a consequence of the sublimation of the reproductive instinct. And sex is a perfectly reasonable principle to elevate to the highest place. Richard Dawkins essentially does that with his insistence on the selfish gene, is that, and you can see how that fits with an evolutionary account of the emergence of human beings. Society is predicated on sex. And then you could branch that out. You could say, well, it's not just sex. There's a variety of hedonistic impulses, right? But they're basically needs or wants, avoidance of pain, pursuit of pleasure. That's a Freudian perspective as well. As biological organisms, our fundamental motivating force is hedonistic.
But don't you think an evolutionary psychologist could give a comprehensively reductive account of patterns of sacrificial behavior in human development? I mean, couldn't there be some just so story as to why a man throws himself on a grenade to save the life of his friends?
Oh, there have been accounts of that sort.
It gets complicated. You get a strictly Darwinian analysis of that does get complicated.
I would sacrifice myself for 2 brothers or 4 cousins.
Right.
That's Robert Trivers' view. Right?
And there's a kind of obviously the Girardian analysis of the sort of the mimetic desire and scapegoating mechanisms and so on. But what's striking, and this is something, I think a conversation that came up in our gospel seminars, I think on the last day when we were going through, looking at Golgotha and those extraordinary, heartbreaking kind of final moments of the climax of the Gospels in some ways, or there's just before the end. And what was striking there is that we decided, yes, this is sacrifice, but Girard was onto something. I can't remember if we discussed Girard, that this is a sacrifice to end all sacrifices. In other words, the message of the New Testament is that sort of evolutionary analysis, as it were, is kind of breaks, comes to a halt, is culminated, is sort of finds a sort of a stopping point, a stopping point, beyond which there will be evolutionary analyses of human behavior will, in at least in Christian contexts or in cultures that have broadly accepted the Christian moral framework, and sacrifice is not going to be necessary anymore. It's not going to fulfill the mechanism.
Or at least its nature won't transform.
Right. And there may be something here to the idea that in a sort of post-Christian moral culture, that logic gets removed, and then we start to see the scapegoating returning, which is something that we might have, I think, identified in different ways in the cultural revolution that's broken across the institutional landscape of the West in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think there's a plausible view to be developed along those lines.
Well, we talked about the potential driving forces of civilization.
Yes.
So let's think of civilization as society. So if it's me alone, that's not a civilization. The minimum unit for the dawn of civilization would be interaction between 2 people. Okay, so then what's the nature of interaction between 2 people? Well, it's sacrifice. And the reason for that is that if I want to establish a relationship with you, even in the moment, but especially one that continues voluntarily and continues to develop upward, then that relationship has a pattern. And the pattern is one of sacrifice. In the simplest possible form, that would be the establishment of a game between 2 children. And the game is predicated on taking turns. First you, then me. Well, the fact that sometimes it's you is a sacrificial offering on my part. I'm offering my primacy. I'm sacrificing my primacy for the sake of the relationship. Well, so we sacrifice to other people to invite them into our circle. But that's not where the sacrificial process stops, because as we become wiser and mature, we sacrifice the present to the future. That's almost a definition of maturity, right? That's the ability to forego gratification. and the ability to regulate hedonistic whim in keeping with its iterated consequences out into an indefinable future. Now, how far should that future extend? Well, the future that Abraham contemplates is infinitely multi-generational, for example. Like God offers Abraham the opportunity to become the father of untold nations for an indefinite amount of time. And the reason for that is Abraham establishes a sacrificial pattern of adventure that optimizes, you could say, optimizes the probability of survival across the longest possible period of time. So you sacrifice to the other in a relationship, you sacrifice the present to the future. When you're attending to the world, you sacrifice as well, because when you attend to any one thing, which you have to do to attend, you prioritize it, you put it at the pinnacle, then everything else that isn't that is sacrificed. And that's already a kind of implicit monotheism in every perceptual act.
But I wonder whether we're equivocating a bit here in how we understand sacrifice. I mean, the sort of classical or anthropological way of thinking about it is, I don't know, I mean, I haven't done a lot of work on this or a lot of reading about it, but my sense is that it's a mechanism to contain violence within a society, to channel it, to channel the violence.
Well, that's the Girardian view.
Well, yes, but you could also look, you don't have to take the mimetic desire approach.
Well, it is a way of containing aggression. Because,
no, so I'm not denying that. I'm saying that that's probably the sort of standard, kind of textbook way of thinking about it in terms of, at scale. But you're introducing something, a slightly different perspective. You're saying
it's wider perspective.
Sacrifice is something, it's more like self-giving or a sort of self-constraint as a part of recognition
it's an upward offering.
Of the other.
Well,
but you see them as brought those two senses as broadly continuous.
Yes. Well, look. With regards to the control of aggression, let's say, children can play or fight. If they play, they don't have to fight. The play is sacrificial. If it's play, it's, for example, if a little boy asks a little girl to play, he'll say, do you want to play house or car, let's say? Okay, well, that's a very particular kind of statement. First of all, it involves want, right? Is this something you would voluntarily engage in? Otherwise, it's not play. And then she has to have a choice of the game. Okay, now the game sets a frame, right? And it's a frame of mutual interaction. Now, as long as the alignment of the players within the game is maintained, there's no reason for aggression. That's not sublimation or inhibition of aggression. That would be more like a Freudian model or a model of Rousseau or Hobbes, that aggression is inhibited by socialization. That's certainly a Rousseauian perspective. It's inhibited. It's clamped down on, and we need to be free. It's like, that's not right at all. If we establish the proper frame of play, aggression is now subdued. It's put it because we could set up an extremely competitive and even near violent game, right? It could be intensely competitive. Well, that means the aggression is integrated. It's not even sublimated, it's integrated because it's put in its proper place. Now, the sacrificial element in that is that, well, it's not about me, not all the time. There's at least reciprocity in it. And so you could imagine that the hallmarks of civilization are twofold. The fundamental hallmarks is, one would be, I sacrifice the present to the future. And then the next would be, I sacrifice my own subjugation to my immediate whims to the benefits of social being at multiple levels simultaneously. So I have a wife, I have friends, I have children. Now that's all sacrificial because it's not about me, but the gain is long-term and productive and expansive, but that's the nature of civilization.
So we've shifted here from, I don't want to call it primitive, but a more ancient way of understanding sacrifice, where you're actually literally sacrificing a victim to, as it were, channel the violence and the mimetic desire, if you take a Girardian view, or within a culture, within a society, within a tribe, and into something that is different, something that gets
transformed psychologically,
that is transformative. And if you think of Genesis 22, the famous account of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, and this is often, Kierkegaard gets very, very, engaged in this story. And yeah, I think the most striking detail, surely, of the story is the resolution, namely
Of course
that
it is.
you are not to sacrifice Isaac. I mean, the ancient Near Eastern literature was packed with stories
it's more than that.
of child sacrifice, where we know the ending of the story, and it seems as if what's happening in Genesis 22 is they're almost setting up for the listener the story that we've heard before. We know this type. Oh yeah, he's got to do it because this is how much he's committed to God. Like Agamemnon and Iphigenia. Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter. We know that story. It's a very familiar story. But there's the twist at the end.
Definitely.
It's not sacrifice, or it's not sacrifice in the sense that you've typically understood.
Just part of what happens in the biblical context is that the idea of sacrifice becomes abstracted. So I'll give you an example that's reasonably concrete. You see this transition from the dramatic and concrete portrayal of sacrifice, so that would be like the literal altar. You see it transforming into something psychological with Jacob and with Abraham. So we could look at Jacob to begin with. So when we encounter Jacob, he's a bad man. He's like Cain. He's the enemy of his brother, and he's willing to use any form of manipulation and treachery to attain his proximal ends. And he's aided and abetted in that effort by his miserable mother, who's an Oedipal queen, who is in love with her son and who does everything she can not only to foster the worst in him, but to betray her other son and her husband. It's a brutal story. And Jacob pushes his betrayal to the point where he makes his brother into a murderous enemy. And Esau has justification for his murderous rage. And so then Jacob decides to leave. Now, this is a very crucial part of the story, because partly he's running away in fear, but that's not all that happens. He's running away because his brother has become murderous, and now he's going to go visit his uncle, say. But on the way, he makes a decision. Now, this is the decision that everyone makes when they decide to change their life. So we can give the devil his due, and we could say, well, he's out from under the thumb of his mother, and now his head's a little clearer, and he decides to aim up, right? So how is that portrayed in the story? Well, he builds an altar, a little mountain that's pointing to God, and he acts out a sacrifice. Okay, so then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that you're doing when you decide to change? Well, the answer is you're building an altar towards the heavens because you've decided that your current pattern of action is ungodly for all intents and purposes. You can put it in secular language if you want, but it doesn't matter. What you're doing is unworthy and sinful. Your aim is misaligned, and you're going to do better. Now, in your ignorance, you might not know what better means, but you know it's at least up. That's the altar. Now it's pointing towards the stars. Now, what are you willing to sacrifice? Well, if the vow is complete, if you really want to change, the vow that you're taking is, well, I'll sacrifice everything about me that's not worthy. Okay, so then what you see in the story of Jacob from then on is a series of sacrificial adventures. And that's developed more thoroughly in the story of Abraham, because Abraham is a story of upward striving adventure, sacrificial adventure. Now remember, when Jacob vows to reorient himself, that's when he has the dream of Jacob's ladder. And so what's happened is that because he's transformed his aim, said, I'm going to be good. Okay, what does that mean? I'm going to aim up. I'm going to transform myself. I'm going to abandon my lesser self. It means all of those things. And it doesn't matter if you think about it as a secular person. It still means the same thing. It means that you've made a distinction between up and down, or good and bad. You've established the moral universe. You've hypothesized that there is a form of the good that you don't have the proper relationship with. Any change necessitates that. And then you have to indicate your willingness to sacrifice. Now, the sacrifice, see, as the biblical stories develop, the sacrifice becomes increasingly abstracted. So, for example...
Well, and in the end, not just abstracted, but finalized and, as it were, distilled and done away with at Golgotha.
Yes, well, that's because in a way, it's taken to it's taken to its ultimate form. Yeah. So, what should you offer to God, so to speak, to ensure that your relationship with him is as perfect as it can be, so that you can walk with God in the Garden of Eden. What are you required to sacrifice? Well, first of all, that's played out, let's say, in the story of Abraham with Isaac. Okay, so God says, well, you have to even sacrifice your own son. And of course, that's one of the biblical passages that people like Dawkins point to when they're speaking of the barbarism of the Old Testament God. But what Dawkins fails to understand is that, as you pointed out, he doesn't take into account the denouement of the story, which is that Abraham gets Isaac back, and permanently.
Which is clearly signaling something, given the fact that the audience would have expected that story to end one way.
Of course.
And the startling way in which it doesn't, in fact, end in that way, makes you think, well, sacrifice is something that we're going to do away with in this form. And I suppose the ultimate denouement of the story is that the son does get sacrificed, that the Father sacrifices God the Son at the end of the Christian scriptures. And isn't the message there that we are not in fact capable of making the sacrifice that we need to make? We, creaturely human beings, are not capable of doing that. In the end, the only thing that can bring the sacrificial cycles to an end, the channeling of violence to an end for good, is not any sacrifice that we can make, but a sacrifice that only God himself can make.
Well, they end up being the same thing. So you could imagine that this would be something equivalent to the imitation of Christ that the Orthodox Christians are stressing, is that as your sacrifice tilted towards the ultimate, the union between man and God would become more and more complete. So it would...
Sure, but even the Orthodox the Orthodox certainly would say the imitation of Christ means that we can affect the sacrifice that Christ himself made.
Christ said that we would, because he said that the people that he left behind would do more wonders than he did.
He would do more wonders, but wouldn't bring about the kind of dispositive sacrifice that brings an end to all sacrifice. That is something that the thrust of the New Testament is. That's something that only Christ can do.
You could think about that core sacrifice that you're describing as the center of all sacrifice. And so you're going to be making particular sacrifices in your own life that are, in a way, peripheral. They're particularized to your time and place. But the more those become archetypal, the more you would fall into that central sacrifice. The more your life would take on that pattern. And there would be a point where there would be no distinction between the pattern that you're acting out and that eternal pattern. They would meld. And that would be the full revelation, you might say, of the image of God in man. And so you're not going to supersede this sacrifice, but you can play it out fully. You're called upon to play it out fully in the confines of your own life. The more thoroughly you do that, the more the pattern of your life is going to become archetypal. It's like you'll come more fully under the sway of a kind of intense gravitational field.
I mean, just step a little bit back from that. I mean, you've been giving this brilliant analysis of biblical archetypes and in the context of sacrifice. You said, it doesn't matter if it's a secular mind, absorbing this or not, or more as, just a standard Christian or Jewish understanding. But the way you've been doing this for so many years now. You did it with the Genesis lectures. We've done it with the Exodus seminars. This book is, packed with a lot of these fantastic insights into the biblical archetypes. And the fact of the matter is, people watch these lectures, they read your books, and they might begin secular, but something happens. They
start to understand.
Well, they start converting to Christianity. They don't see it just as stories. They see them as stories that are disclosive of the way the world actually is. And I know we're sort of moving away a little bit from what we were talking about earlier, but what do you think, what accounts for that phenomenon? Have you ever really understood that? Do you sense there is a renewal of interest in Christianity, or a renewal of commitment to Christianity among, shall we say, circles and maybe an emerging counter elite? It's certainly in circles where it was previously not at all fashionable to be talking about these things.
Well, I do think that I think the Enlightenment has run its course, and its internal contradictions have become unbearable. And that's part of what's making itself manifest
The
in the culture
fetishizing
war.
of reason, the stress on the disproportionate stress on autonomy, on freedom from all unchosen obligations, those sorts of contradictions.
Yes,
that are psychological contradictions, but also
well, it turns out that
socially divisive as well.
Yes, definitely, both of those. Well, it turns out that if you take Protestant liberalism, let's say, and its secular variations to its ultimate conclusion, it turns meaningless. And that's unbearable for people, even in the presence of material security. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what accounts for the lack of meaning? And I would say that what accounts for the lack of meaning is the absence of sacrificial responsibility, because our anthropology was wrong. The essence of the self is sacrificial. It's not hedonistic. It's not atomistic. It's also not bounded by the physical parameters of your material structure. No.
Does that mean that the liberal state needs to move in and begin to police the boundaries between these different selves or different siloed communities within multi-ethnic, multi-faith societies, such that the liberal state inevitably becomes less and less liberal, as it were?
Well, that definitely happens. Well, part of the problem with turning the individualistic enterprise over to the hedonists, let's say, so that you can pursue your whim, which is that's, I suppose, a variant of human rights discussion.
It takes a lot of state intervention and policing to, as it were, run a society where all individuals are pursuing their individual whim.
It takes the more whim that's pursued, the more the all-seeing eye of Sauron becomes an absolute inevitability and necessity. Exactly. And that is associated with that collapse into meaninglessness as well.
You've been watching Britain, what's been happening here very closely for many years, and you've made a number of interventions. And what's your sense of how that frame can be applied to what's going on in the political landscape here, the cultural landscape here? I know, for example, just in, very recently, I know you've interviewed both Kimi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, the leader of the British Conservative Party here, and Nigel Farage. You've interviewed him a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, I think.
Yeah,
the
twice,
leader of this disruptive new force on the right in Britain is currently polling, comfortably ahead of both Labour and the Tory party. It's the first time, in 250 years that the Tory party has not been first or second in national approval. What was your take on those two figures, and what's your sense of what's happening here politically? We're in a state of extraordinary flux and upheaval. Do you have a sense of where the country's headed from looking at it from afar?
Well, what I would hope for is that the same thing happens in the UK that happened in Canada. There's a weird parallel, it's a reversal too, because the Reform Party, of course, was predicated on at least some of the principles of the Reform Party in Canada, which is very strange.
I think it was deliberately chosen as a name for that reason.
Yeah. Well, that's a very strange occurrence. Now, what happened in Canada was that the Reform pulled the Conservatives back to a socially conservative populism and gave some intellectual voice to that, particularly in the form of Preston Manning. And then that forced a reconfiguration of the right in Canada and then a reunion.
You think that might happen here?
Well, that would be the best outcome. Like Kemi and Nigel have a real opportunity at the moment to go at each other hammer and tongs.
But they both said any kind of pact is out of the question.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. That's rubbish. They're not going to make a pact with the Labour Party. And if push comes to shove after an election and a coalition government became possible, they jump at it in a second because neither of them are clueless. And so I can understand that's part of the posturing, and part of that's even necessary.
Which of the two do you think would make the better Prime Minister?
I think you're in a fortunate situation at the moment because both of those people are pretty smart and they're both pretty tough and they're both credible. I mean, Kemi is an interesting figure. She reminds me a bit of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's like the moral foreigner in the Old Testament texts, right? Because there's frequently stories in the Old Testament where the Israelite population has become warped and demented in a variety of ways.
So
and
she's
then
a Moabite, a Ruth coming in to
exactly, or Moses' father-in-law, right, Jethro, who establishes the principle of subsidiarity. So now and then you get these visionary foreigners who come back and say, "You people are forgetting what you're all about." Well, Ayan's very good at that. Hirsi Ali. She did that brilliantly.
She's
Infidel.
much more uncompromising on her diagnosis of what's gone wrong and what needs to be put right, perhaps, than Kemi Badenoch.
She is, but she's also not as constrained. Well, that's right. She's not as constrained. But Kemi, to her credit, is very smart, a lawyer and an engineer, which is a good combination. And she can see what's valuable about the civilization of the West, particularly the UK, and she can agitate for it in a way that would be difficult for someone who wasn't an outsider. So that's very interesting.
Then why isn't she agitating, or why do some people think she's not agitating for some of the policy solutions that Nigel Farage is advocating for? For example, getting outside the jurisdiction of a foreign court in Strasbourg so that we can find it easier to regain control of the borders, for example.
Well, I think part of it is that politicians are constrained. Yes, they tend not to be icebreakers on the policy side. My experience has been that, one of the things the Conservatives in Canada have told me is that I can break the ice on certain topics, climate, say, for example, being one of them, and move the window for acceptable conversation forward, and then they can step behind me, right? And you could be cynical about that and say that they lack courage, but you don't want to get all moralistic and on your high horse to begin with. You might also say, well, the politicians are constrained by the necessity of broad public appeal, and if you're going to be on the bleeding edge of a discussion, to begin with, you can be in a minority position, obviously, and that's not exactly their position. But Kemi and Nigel they have such an opportunity because they could one-up each other. I saw this a little bit in the discussion with Nigel because I know that he's a climate change skeptic, or at least a skeptic of the idiot economic policies that
he thinks certainly that the trade-offs entailed by net zero will be ruinous to the working classes, to the poor, who are always disproportionately affected by higher energy prices.
Right, and that's a good start.
Yeah.
What I'd like to see happen, and this could happen in this head-to-head debate between Badenoch and Farage, I'd like to see them dare each other to abandon the climate apocalypse narrative entirely. And they can see they're in a position now where they can do that because one of them, if they're head-to-head on a certain issue, one of them could step forward a bit more. So Farage will say, for example, well, we're not going to do 2030, maybe we'll do 2050. Well, and then Badenoch could say, well, maybe we'll do 2100. And then Farage could say, how about we're just done with the whole mess, right? And they can test each other that way.
The problem is that Nigel will always be able to say that the mess began with you. The mess with, and I think that's a sort of, the Tories, I think, are very much hamstrung on all of these different issues because it will always be possible for either Farage or Starmer to push back and say, well, hold on, you're trying to outflank me, but every time, the more you outflank me, the more inconsistent you are with the regime that you propped up for 14 years. Well, that's definitely
Badenoch's paradox. I mean, when I talked to her, she made a point of indicating that she was a very early skeptic, for example, of the net zero fiasco and had objected to it from the beginning. Now, you could debate about whether she had objected with sufficient strenuousness, but she is trying to differentiate herself from her forebears. And whether
it wasn't her brief, the principle of collective cabinet ministerial responsibility is an important one, and so she would have aired her grievances internally, no doubt, but it's probably not fair to blame her for not resigning on
well, it's also up to her to differentiate herself and also to indicate that the Conservative Party has undergone a sufficient transformation to actually change, which it likely hasn't.
One of the issues she has been consistent on, and probably did more than any other Tory minister to fight, was the issue that catapulted you to fame way back in 2016, the issue of transgenderism and all of the coercive policies on speech and single-sex spaces that flowed out of that.
Mm-hmm.
As you look back on that period, you were a voice in the wilderness of immense courage back in 2016. I think that's where you first came on my radar, at least. Do you feel a sense of vindication, of satisfaction, as you see, not everywhere, but significant swathes of the West now, sanity is beginning to return on this issue? Would you think would you sense a sort of victory there, a sort of personal satisfaction? Could more be done? Is it?
Well, I feel the sort of relief that you might feel if you saw a terrible predator lurking in the bushes and you were, fortunate enough to lead people away from its jaws, even though it had devoured some. It's hard to feel any personal satisfaction, partly because with regards to the gender issue, there's been thousands and thousands of young people who've been butchered in its name. And maybe it's receded, although we'll see about that. These proclivities are a lot more pernicious than anybody optimistic might presume. Trump has made so-called gender-affirming care, which is the most pernicious misnaming that Satan himself could possibly imagine. He's put a serious stick in the spokes of that particular bicycle, but I wouldn't get too triumphalist about it yet. The nature worshippers and the transhumanists haven't been defeated by any stretch of the imagination.
Do you think the problem here is liberalism, as it were, degenerating? Or do you think, I know that Kemi Badenoch put it as a sort of, the analysis was illiberalism's being hacked. Do you think these sorts of problems are a feature of liberalism? That is to say, how liberalism was always going to end? Or do you think it's a bug, some sort of external hack or disruption?
I think that if you... So
just to make sense of the question, that in the context of the trans debate, my sense has been that if the doctrine of liberalism is endless emancipation from any ties or obligations that I don't, in my self-legislating self, is not comfortable with, then I can liberate myself from
everything,
even if it's the limits of my very embodiment. Yeah. Now, some people don't accept my take on that. They just say, "Oh, there's some sort of kind of Marxism, for example, has come in and disrupted it." Do you think that what we're seeing in the unraveling of liberalism in many parts of the West is how liberalism is always going to end?
That's part of that. That's right. Part of that end of the Enlightenment. Even sure, it is. It's like So
if that's the case, conservatism, which often is thought of as a kind of liberalism at the speed limit, should also, as understood in that sense, should also be done away with. What we would need to recover is something like...
Conservatism isn't liberalism in slow motion.
Well, I've got the bust of Roger Scruton up there. He once said in his last book, conservatism, and he's, one of the godfather of conservative philosophy, at least here in the UK, he once said that conservatism is a hesitation within liberalism. That's a fairly standard view among many, many conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think you and I probably would push beyond that. We'd say, no, actually the seeds of its own demise were in liberalism's origins. And if that's true, isn't conservatism, or whatever name we want to give it, a recovery of something more ancient that is upstream of that, whether it's nourished by the biblical stories, whether it's nourished by Greece and Rome, whether it's nourished by the scholastics and the Renaissance. Do you think the task is recovering something that's upstream of the Enlightenment, and what would that be?
Well, yes, I definitely think that. I think that we've outlined that to some degree already. I would say that conservatives stand for the primacy of the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? That's the bedrock of civilization. Now, then that's
gratitude, acceptance of limits as they're given to us, that
adoption of responsibility,
that we discover the world, we organize our perceptions of it, but we don't construct it. We don't just make up whatever narrative we want as we go along. This is your diagnosis.
Well, we certainly don't.
Post-structuralism.
We don't make up the narrative if the fundamental narrative is one of voluntary self-sacrifice.
Absolutely. I think this is the key to what you saw before most of us, namely that the antidote to post-structuralism can't just be another story. It must be a story that claims to be disclosive of truth. That is to say...
Yeah, the nature of reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you would say that that's why you're drawn back to the Bible rather than to say,
yes,
Abraham, it's a story of adventure, but so's the Odyssey. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it's a more interesting and more invigorating adventure. But you think, no, it's these texts, the texts that Jews and Christians recognize as revelation, that are uniquely disclosive of the way reality is, and that's what needs to be conserved against liberalism.
Here's an interesting fact. Every single Catholic and Protestant majority country outside of Africa is a fully functioning Western democracy of the sort that the dispossessed flee to of their own free will. Okay, 100%. 47 of 50 Islamic majority countries are totalitarian. Let's leave it at that. Are totalitarian. Okay. It doesn't take much perspicacity to infer that there might be a causal link. Now, the question is, what's the link? Well, if the idea that voluntary self-sacrifice is the proper foundation of civilized society and an integrated psyche, because those two things go together, then the Judeo-Christian meta-narrative is correct. Now, what that means metaphysically, I don't know what it means metaphysically, not exactly. I mean, you have the idea that the ultimate sacrifice of Christ is the principle upon which the world was founded at the beginning of time.
It's very different from, you use the compound Judeo-Christian there, and I think it's a convenient label. But I sometimes get a little bit uneasy about it because, we've already in our conversation so far drawn quite a sharp distinction between the understanding of sacrifice in, in the Old Testament and the closural perspective on sacrifice in the New Testament, the idea that the sacrifice on Golgotha is the last sacrifice. It brings the whole...
it's the eternal sacrifice.
Right, and so I'm thinking... And I actually looked at this the other day, did an engram, Google engram of it. Judeo-Christian as a term does not really emerge until after the Second World War. But that's when it suddenly goes up. And I'm wondering, is it helpful? Should we be thinking of Judaism and Christianity? Yes, of course, as closely connected, but as distinct traditions with distinct narratives, which are pushing towards, in the end, quite different conceptions of
there's definitely
reality,
a different conception of the primacy of Christ's sacrifice. Sure. Obviously, that's a dividing line. Yeah. I've been informed in my thinking tremendously by the Old Testament stories and have an immense amount of respect for the Jewish intellectual and literary tradition. And I think that the notion that the sacrificial pattern in the Old Testament culminates in the New Testament, it makes perfect narrative sense. And I understand what it means. And it seems to me to be right. Now, right, why? Well, there's a technical reason in a way. I mean, one of Jung's claims, for example, was that the Christian passion was an archetypal redemptive tragedy. And by archetypal, he meant that it specified the central pattern with unerring accuracy, and so couldn't be superseded. Now, the reason
archetype that couldn't actually have a type.
It couldn't be superseded. Because so a way of thinking about
it could be imitated maybe, but it wouldn't have the certainly in context of Christian theology, it wouldn't have the salvific effects that are attributed.
Well, it is imitated. I mean, the martyr,
the redemption of humanity. No one other than Christ can or needs to achieve.
Right. Well, that's almost and that's the hypothesis, and the idea. I mean, that psychological idea is something like this. That tragedy, redemptive tragedy, but let's just go with tragedy to begin with, has a form. Now, we know that because we wouldn't be able to have the category of tragedy if tragedy didn't have a form. Now, you could imagine 1,000 tragedies. Now, you could imagine extracting the essential features of those tragedies. A large language model could probably do that, by the way. Anyways, then you could imagine constructing a single tragedy that exemplified the core elements of the common features of tragedy. And I think that's exactly what the Passion story does.
Do you think, I mean, there's a big debate about this among theologians, particularly in Cambridge, as to whether tragedy is the right prism to understand what happens on Golgotha. I mean,
well, it doesn't specify the resurrection.
No, that's right. And
that's a problem.
That's a problem, exactly. So the question is, the denouement, as it were, the resurrection, as it were, it doesn't permit us to think of that sort of radical sense of loss and incommensurability that you see is very much the mark of the tragic.
Well, it's actually a comedy, technically speaking, right? Because it has a happy ending, right? But the bulk of the drama is the tragedy and the encounter with the depths of suffering. And you could think about the Passion story as a thorough explanation of the dimensions of suffering, right? Because the death occurs to someone who's young. It's the most shameful possible death. It was designed to be the most painful possible death. It's imposed by a tyrant. It's brought about by betrayal. Like, you can just stack. All you have to do is make a list of all the terrible things that could happen to you that you would think were terrible, expand them so they're the worst of their form, and then aggregate them. And that's what you have in the Passion story. And so that's in a way that's why it's a limit case. You could tell another terrible story, but if you told a story that was just as terrible, it would look very much like that story.
And it's a story that gives one hope. Would you say that it's a story that gives you hope to a degree that no other story can? I mean, that was the sense, I think, around the table for all of us, even those of us who would not consider ourselves church-going Christians. I mean, we like to talk on this podcast about what dawn might look like.
Well, even practically speaking, I mean, the Christians defeated Rome. Well,
from the catacombs.
Exactly. And so
peacefully,
merely from a secular perspective. Well, and that means they also established civilization on a basis other than that of, let's call it, nobility and power.
And what were they doing in the catacombs? They were celebrating the Eucharist. They were They were not repeating the sacrifice of Christ. They were recalling the sacrifice of Christ. And that was actually the reason they were in the catacombs, was because really it was on the Sundays that they that as it were, the persecution really happened, because it was the best way of finding out, most efficient way of finding out who was a Christian. It was when you watch what they do on the first day of the week. They're the only ones who gather on the first day of the week. Very eccentric bunch. Hence the catacombs. And
well, you have this weird inversion of power too that Nietzsche described and criticized. The part of the Passion story, part of the implication of the Passion story, is that the ultimate sovereign of mankind is someone who subverts power to service to the lowly, right? And so it's a complete inversion of the idea of noble power, and it wins.
So, but do you get off Nietzsche's bus? I mean, do you say, look, Nietzsche went too far in his critique that Christianity ended up valorizing victimhood and slave morality? And do you think, I've come across a couple of Nietzscheans myself who'd say, Christianity is the problem here. The valorizing of weakness, victimhood culture, this is the way Christianity was always going to end.
I think it's one of the most common misinterpretations of Christian doctrine.
Right.
It can go in that direction. Yeah. It's a heresy. Yeah. And it's a comprehensible heresy. But no, I think Nietzsche was wrong in that regard. Yeah. He was wrong in many fundamental ways.
I mean, it's funny, Nietzsche, obviously, he advances this view that Christianity is a mechanism for the weak to keep in check the strong, to create an artificial level playing field of kind of egalitarianism. And Marx, around about the same time, a little bit sooner, is arguing that no, what religion is, it's a tool that the powerful use, the property-owning classes use to keep in check
Right.
the poor. And
it's being
so
criticized from both
it's funny how
perspectives.
these two great critiques of Christianity in the 19th century can't both be right.
Right.
Maybe they're both wrong, but they can't both be right. There's a deep tension there.
Definitely. And it's paradoxical.
and
I mean, you can't have both those criticisms at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that the strain of thought that valorizes the victim is the spirit of Cain and not the spirit of Abel. And Christianity is the spirit of Abel, not the spirit of Cain.
So maybe it's that part of the problem here is that it's the valorizing of victimhood, but also at one that has forgotten that sacrifice has been put to an end, and as it were, the sacrificial logic, or at least what broke the...
Christ isn't a victim.
No. Well, yes and no. I mean, I think the issue is...
It's not a victim because he does it voluntarily. It's not like it's imposed on him, although in principle...
The ambiguity, of course, is there in Gethsemane. There's a sense that he does do it voluntarily.
Yes, right?
There's
of course there's some hesitance. I mean, of course there is. But the voluntary aspect is absolutely crucial. Like we know, for example, if you look at how people respond psychophysiologically to stress...
The surrendering of, it's not my will, but yours be done,
Well, if I impose a stress on you and I impose it on you involuntarily, your pattern of psychophysiological response is entirely different, right down to the neurochemical level, than the pattern that you'll bring to that you'll allow to manifest if you're doing it voluntarily. There's a huge difference between subjugation to fate and acceptance of fate, or welcoming or celebration of fate. And Christ's sacrifice is a celebration of the most brutal fate. And it's an impossible paradox. And does it inspire hope? Well, everyone hopes in their heart of hearts that they'll be able to contend with their dreadful fate nobly. And it's certainly what we admire in people, and it's what we hope will happen to the people we love who are suffering a mortal wound. We hope they go to their grave with their head held high and with dignity, and they don't degenerate into anger and bitterness and self-hate and turn against the world. So our ability to admire that fortitude in the face of catastrophe is innate. And no wonder, because there isn't anything different. There's no difference between contending with your fate and living nobly. Now, part of the reason the liberal project, let's say, has found its logical conclusion is because it's been played out. It's been played out to the end. Look, the same thing happens to the Israelites that's happened to the West. You remember when Moses is called away by God to Mount Sinai so that the commandments can be delivered. Moses leaves the Israelites behind, and he leaves them in the hands of the political voice, Aaron. And so what you see there is what happens to a society when the foundation, the voice of the foundation, disappears. Well, what happens to Aaron is that this is like a populism, you might say, a narrow populism. Aaron gives the people what they want. But see, that's a weird formulation, because the people, properly construed, aren't what they want. If the people devolve into what they want, then the people are possessed by their wants. And that makes them into hedonistic 2-year-olds, right? It's a very weird thing for us to say that we are what we want. You can invert that easily and say, no, now you're possessed by your fractionated whims. You're a puppet
your
on the
desire
strings
is
of
not
your whims.
Constrained by your reason. It's not
not constrained by the future.
Your awareness of the truth and your intuition for the
It's
good.
not constrained by your love for other people. It's not constrained by your responsibility, right? It's free. It has free reign. That's anarchic freedom. Well, that's what happens in the worship of the golden calf. And that's orgiastic hedonism immediately emerges. And you might say, well, why not? Well, Moses actually tells the people, he said, well, first of all, you've become a laughing stock to your enemies, and that's not a very good idea when they're watching, right? And that's something the West should take serious heed of, clearly. But it's more than that. It's that a hedonistic game degenerates as you play it, and that's what makes it wrong. Now, one of the things that I've really noticed as I've lectured in many, many places is that if I do draw the relationship between, let's say, responsible self-sacrifice and meaning, people cotton onto that immediately. And this has especially been true with young men. I say, well, your life is meaningless. You're unable to bear the weight of your suffering. You're weak. You're not a blessing to yourself. You're suffering. Well, why? Well, it's paradoxically, it's because you haven't imposed upon yourself enough constraint. You haven't adopted enough responsibility. You have to stop thinking about your narrow self because you're just a puppet of that. And you have to, well, how about aim up, get married, have some children, put your community in order, like pick up your cross, walk uphill. And that it's not because you should, although you should. It's not because you should. It's because that's where all the meaning is. And that's another piece of evidence that the proper foundation of civilization is voluntary service.
Yeah, and that strikes me as a fundamentally conservative
That's exactly
intuition.
It. That's exactly
because it's not be the change that you want to be, exercise your freedom, you are independent, you're autonomous. And it works. You will find meaning not just by making it up, not just by constructing it, not just by exercising your freedom, as Sartre and Camus might say. You know, the existentialists say we're free from essence, we're free from bourgeois
restraint.
Morality.
They think of all social being as restraint.
Right. What you've, I think, taught so many young men for many years is that meaning and true freedom comes from accepting the constraints that the world places upon us and trying to operate
welcoming them
with an attitude of gratitude, as the Americans like to say, and not with a sense that you can manipulate the world and the world deserves to give you an easy time, to give you an easy life.
Or that other people are imposing on you. It's like, well, why should I regulate my sexual behavior? What an imposition. The bloody French leftists were all over that, right? Sexual freedom. Well, there's nothing about that isn't golden calf worship. Right. It's preposterous.
And what you're drawing, and you're not saying that means an end to freedom. It's not as if liberalism has a monopoly on freedom. In fact, I think what you seem to be suggesting is that the right way to think about freedom is that we should have the freedom to do what we ought to do, and what we ought to do that will align us with the good, align us with the true, and invest our life with the only kind of meaning worth having, as opposed to mere freedom to do what we want to do, as it
what the worst in us wants us to do. Yeah, well, this is exactly. So when Moses stands up against the Pharaoh and objects to tyranny, he says something very particular, as you'll remember from the Exodus seminar. He doesn't say, let my people go, which is the civil rights cry, right? He doesn't say that. He says, let my people go, so they may celebrate me in the wilderness, right? So it's a vision of ordered freedom. So you move from tyranny, and that's a movement, but it's not anarchic desert dwelling where you worship the golden calf. It's the construction of a subsidiary hierarchy of responsibility as an alternative to tyranny and slavery. It can't
just be mere emancipation into the sunlit uplands. There's got to be a reason for it, a purpose, and a kind of a horizon that invests it with meaning, a meaning that is given, not just imposed upon the world.
Exactly. And that is what conservatives have to offer young people at the moment. And they will take that up because no one is making that offer. And so they're all lost. Well, we can do whatever we want. It's like, no, you are now the slave to the worst of your whims. And there's nothing that makes people more miserable than that. We know that. The most miserable people at the moment are young, progressive women. Well, why? Well, because they're disintegrated. And so they have no psychological integration. So they're a war of competing forces. They're a house divided against itself. And they have no social affiliation. Well, human beings we're so social. We're so social, you can punish psychopaths by putting them in isolation. So we're sacrificial to the core, human beings.
It's certainly striking that the last, 5 or 6 decades that has seen extraordinary changes and equal pay and many of the legislative victories that feminism worked so hard to achieve has not gone hand in hand with an increase in the sense of psychological well-being and flourishing. In fact, it seems to be quite the right. Correlation is not causation, and so on. And there are complexities, of course, in analyzing levels of psychological well-being, as you will
but the overall picture is pretty clear.
It's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Final question, Jordan. It's been just so good talking with you and learning from you as always. This podcast is called First Light, and we like to think as we draw to a close about, what dawn might look like. What might give us hope? What gives you hope as you look across the landscape of the West? You travel to all of these different cities. You engage with so many people. And of course, a lot of the battles you're in, inevitably mean that you're going to take a pretty pessimistic view on lots and lots and lots of issues because things are not in a great way. Let's be honest, across the West. I think we're agreed on that. But are there flickers of hope? If there are, what are they for you?
They're raging fires of hope.
They're raging fires of hope.
Yeah.
Good. Well, just tell us about some of those fires as we draw to a close.
Well, it's good to see where the monsters are. I mean, you need to know.
That's progress.
But you also have to understand that there are no insurmountable obstacles to people of faith and goodwill. I believe that's the case. What makes me optimistic? Well, I believe that I think the Enlightenment is over. And I don't think that will mean a catastrophic decline into, say, hedonism or attraction by the blandishments of power. I think we're at a point now where we can actually understand our foundational stories. We can unite our reason with our faith. I believe that. And that's not subjugation of one to the other. It's more like a clarification.
And that's not just believing those foundational stories to be useful or to be generative of civilizational fruits, but to be disclosive of reality, to be
yes,
true.
It means that we'll have to reconceptualize what we mean by the real. Pajot says, for example, Jonathan, our mutual friend, that the foundation of the world is sacrifice. Now, that's definitely a biblical truism, you might say. But it's also now understandable. Because attention has a sacrificial structure, and motivation has a sacrificial structure, and so does perception, and so does social being. Now, what that means metaphysically, we haven't worked that out yet, because there's still a contradiction, let's say, between the materialist account of the emergence of the human psyche, the evolutionary account, let's say, and the insistence that even perception has a sacrificial foundation. But I've been talking to Brett Weinstein about this in some detail. I don't think that's an insurmountable problem. And I think the reason that we're seeing this wave of conversions, let's say, on the intellectual side, that's Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, Diane Hersey-Ali, Neil Ferguson,
Paul
Russell Brand. It's just
and dozens of others who perhaps a little less well known, but just as reflective.
Well, and you also see a revival of religious belief, particularly in attendance.
So what's taking you so long?
Well, I'm playing a useful role.
You are indeed.
So
maybe your destiny is to be like Moses. You'll get just up to the promised land and see it in a distance, but die before you get there.
Yes, well, there's worse destinies than that. So, you do your best to play your part where you're situated. And so that seems to be working spectacularly well, right? Miraculously well, even. And so we'll keep playing it out and keep striving for understanding. And that the horizon of further understanding is infinite. And so I'm not going to run out of things to do. And I'm very hopeful about our possibilities. I think we have a landscape of infinite abundance before us if we have the courage to reach out and accepted. There'll be sacrifices necessary along the way. Sacrifices of pride and presumption in particular, but the world's a horizon of infinite possibility. That's the proper way of conceptualizing it. That is the biblical insistence. That's the chaos that God confronts at the beginning of time, now and forever. And that's what consciousness contends with. And if you're oriented upward and you're motivated by the desire that all things flourish and you're willing to abide by the truth, then you can make the desert bloom. And so that's true. It's not superstitious faith. It's the essence of productive society and psychological integration and stability. And I think that's all clear now. So,
amen to that. Jordan, thank you for joining me today.
Good to see you.
Good to
Thanks
see
for
you
the invitation.